Lisa.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you today?
Good. So we haven't talked for almost a week.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you for lunch, by the way.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So I would love to start a conversation to why I ended up with a free lunch. How does that work?
That sounds great.
So you and I met, I believe it was the end of October.
Right.
And our very first meeting started off with a conversation is, do you want to talk and be a caregiver, or do you want to talk because you also have your own business, or do you want to also balance both and bring both into the equation? Right. And we decided initially we're going to focus on you.
Right.
You as Wendy, not you as in your business.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So when we initially started, you had been going through a year.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse my language, but maybe a terrible year.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that is kind of where things were at. But I actually want to start a little bit further back. And I want you to kind of talk about what your caregiver journey looked like initially. We're going to ease into the stuff, if that's okay with you.
Right. So, Lisa, my caregiver journey started a long time ago, and I identified in talking with you, it was about when I was 4 years old.
Right.
And I really didn't identify myself as a caregiver then, and I didn't identify myself as a caregiver in October.
Right.
Because it's part of who I am.
Fair.
And it's part of my DNA that I was just doing what I do and it's just me.
Right.
So to label myself and use that identity as a caregiver, it just...
So who did you think you were? If you weren't a caregiver, who was Wendy in that role?
Right. And looking back at my childhood and growing up, I was always that person. That expectation was there. And I could meet that expectation, again, because that was part of me. So through the journey and growing up, I was always there to take care of people. So that became part of my identity.
Right.
Of who I am.
So how did, at 4 years old, were you taken care of? Because, a big thing that we talk about now and we really try to promote the education piece on is young caregivers.
Right.
And at the moment, I'm pretty sure you're not in that young caregiver age group.
Not at all.
Right. So, and 27% of caregivers are between the ages of 15 and 19. And that was a statistic that came out from the U of A in October of 2019.
Right.
And I was like, wow. And that's where they can start doing research, is at 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So how many people younger, like we're just talking about, you start to identify now, thinking back, you were 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a 4-year-old caregiver look like?
And at 4 years old, when I look back, and that's when I can remember back when it all started. It could have been the littlest things of doing things for my parents, helping my dad out with my mom, because my mom wasn't healthy when we were younger.
Right.
So, and that's all I can remember back to is when I was 4 years old.
Right.
So when I got into the 10 years old, and I specifically remember one incident where my dad was at work and my mom had to go by ambulance and I had to call the ambulance. I had to take care of all of that. So It was an expectation that was just there, that it was normal in my life.
So can we elaborate a little bit of what the medical situation happened that you had to call the ambulance for your mom?
Mm-hmm. My mom was always very sick all the time. There wasn't one diagnosis of a medical situation or anything, or diagnosis of anything. She was just always very, very ill. And at that specific day, and I really remember that day, is that she was hemorrhaging.
Oh.
And I remember calling my uncle and my dad, and I happened to be at home when she was there. So right away, my dad just said, Wendy, you got to take care of it until I can get there, and call the ambulance and do it. Just take care of it. So right away, to me, that was normal. That was part of just what I did.
Right.
Yes.
So that is 9 and 10, and then you also
Right.
had a sibling too.
I have 2 siblings.
Right.
Yes.
And how did they fit into that?
They didn't. So
Interesting.
they didn't fit into it.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So my 2 brothers, and me being the only girl as well too. So I think that definitely changed things with my parents. They were very, very high expectations of me.
Okay.
Very, very high expectations. And so I was always the one that had to take care of everything.
Right.
So as time went on, and that's when I was 9 years old, as time went on, I can recall when I was 17 years old. And my mom phoned me saying, your dad's going, now it's my dad, is getting rushed to the hospital, heart attack. So
When you were 17?
when I was 17.
And how old were your siblings at that time?
My siblings would have been 14 and 20.
Okay. So you have one older brother and one younger brother.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right. But they were never asked to do anything.
Okay.
Never. It was, they were protected.
Right. Or maybe their process of doing stuff is more on the protection side. You know, if you look at the feminine masculine, sometimes we'll see, you know, earlier we had an interview that we did with Mike.
Mm-hmm.
And his thing is all about the protector and supporter and not identifying as that caregiver.
Right.
Right. And whereas myself is more of the motherly figure, the nurturing. So, and the genetic disposition, sometimes it shows up like we are just expected as the feminine person to hold up in that role. And then the masculine, i.e. your brothers, potentially have a different role or what that may look like.
Right.
Would that be the perception? I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
You know, and I would tend to agree with that for sure, Lisa. And I think the dynamics in my family was a little different.
Fair.
They protected them for a different reason.
Oh.
Not that it was gender related in
Okay.
any way, and that nurturing part of it with myself, because I was actually the only birth child.
Okay.
To my parents.
Okay.
So this shouldn't make a difference anyway at all, but that's where it all started. That's where I truly believe the expectation and my journey started in life as being that caregiver, because my 2 brothers, and like I say, it doesn't make a difference. We're not the birth children of my parents.
So you feel the expectation was slightly different because you were genetically born to them.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Definitely.
So was that ever acknowledged or said, or is it just something that you felt?
We talked about it.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a
because
really intriguing conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Yeah, there was a point that as life went on, that, you know, in the last few, probably about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, that I did have that conversation with them, because it's something that makes me who I am today. And I wanted just to talk about it.
Right.
And ask them, is that, and it definitely was.
So that is like really hard conversation to have.
Sure it is. Yeah.
And do you feel it? Because I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but through that whole process of stuff, obviously there was little bits of trauma that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that now having this conversation of understanding what is happening, it had to also bring up some limiting beliefs that you had about yourself or about your brothers with your own judgment, because you've already said there's high expectations,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so, and I've known you for, well, we met probably a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we never really got intimately connected until you came to Caregivers Alberta as a client, right?
That's right.
But one thing that I do recall, because it was a Womanitions event that we met at,
Right.
and you spoke at that event.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going up and speaking to you, and I just remember your demeanor and that, you really strive for excellence, perfection. Am I reading into that wrong?
Not at all.
Right.
Not at all.
So with that perfection and that expectation that was set on you potentially by your family 40 years ago.
Sure. Absolutely. We'll go with that one.
Do you like that way?
You bet.
So, right? And then not having any conversations until 7 years ago. I can only imagine what that expectation that your parents potentially put on you and then you end up putting on yourself.
Right.
And what's really intriguing, now we'll move forward slightly, because when I met you in October,
right,
you still had an extremely high expectation of yourself. And not saying that you still don't, but I think it's morphed a little bit now. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Definitely so.
Because, you have been through a significant amount of caregiving in the last number of years.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I want to hear about some of the difficulties that you had as a caregiver.
Many difficulties as a caregiver. And the first difficulty I had was I didn't identify myself as a caregiver. So I truly believe you do not identify yourself as a caregiver. The rest of it it's different. You're not gonna understand.
So can you elaborate a little bit more about that? Because we talk about identifying as a caregiver,
right,
and not identifying as a caregiver. And I want to know before what your thought process of a caregiver was and why it's changed now.
Mm-hmm. I didn't really have a thought process in any way of what a caregiver was, because I just did what I did.
Right.
And we do what we do. And I think there's a lot of people that just were very reactive. So day by day, we're living our lives. We're doing what we have to do. We don't think of ourselves as that caregiver.
Right.
So when I did identify myself as a caregiver, and the only reason I identified myself as a caregiver when I went to you.
Okay. So now let's kind of catch up on this, because now I want to talk about the very first day that you ended up coming to see me. How did that even come about?
So being the very strong person that I am, I could not self-identify that I was in trouble. And I definitely put on a strong front to everybody.
So you thought.
So I thought.
Right.
But all it was me saying something, but it wasn't, it was just a conversation. But somebody knew that wasn't me, because it was a lot of trauma, short-term trauma in my life, that they said, I was talking to one person, she went to somebody else she knew, that person called me, had a conversation, and I couldn't figure out why that person was calling me, and we were talking the way we were. So my spidey senses, so to call, were I was aware something was different here. So then that's when she asked, and for me to be honest with her, was I in trouble? Was I mentally in trouble? And I'm probably one of the least vulnerable people, because I do have that protective shield up, and to let people in to know that I can't handle everything. So I told her yes, I was. And then she asked my permission if she could connect me with you, Lisa.
Right.
And my biggest worry was there is because of my business and how I'm connected into this community, is that it would reflect on me as a person and to connect with you.
Right. So now what I would like to ask you is, can we kind of talk about what the last years look like for you? Because I don't think people understand the amount of compassion fatigue, caregiving fatigue, mental health, how it was affected
Oh yeah.
in grief.
Mm-hmm.
Did I mention trauma? Because trauma was a significant part of it as well,
Right.
right? I don't want you to disclose anybody's names.
Right.
I just want to talk about the whole situation from the beginning of 2019, because I think that's initially where you have been caregiving for a long time. Like, we know that you were caregiving for your parents previous to the end of, like, the beginning of last year.
Right.
So we know this.
Right.
We know, I think at that point in time, your mom was already living in a long-term resident care, right?
November of 2018.
18.
Yes.
Right. So we're aware of that. And you were also supporting your elderly father.
Right.
Who was okay. Or so we thought.
Right.
Right?
Right. So we thought.
So we thought.
Yes.
So maybe you can pick up on your caregiving journey from January 2019. Because really, we never know when that stuff is going to hit the fan.
Right.
And our cup is going to overflow. And, you know, we're talking initially when we met was almost the end of 2019. But that cup started overflowing long before then.
Long before.
Right? So we'll just kind of encapsulate the initial conversation about mom and dad. You know, and we should mention also that you also had lost a brother a couple years before that, or a number of years before that.
Right.
So you've already had a number of traumatic things happen to you.
Right.
And then now we're in 2019, mom's in care, and let's go from there if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with that, please.
You are like me, and this is why Mike got me this, but I need to show you. Do you see this?
I do.
What is it?
Okay, I don't have my glasses on. It looks like a turtle.
I was going to say, here, you want to look?
Yeah. It's a turtle.
Right.
Yeah.
What is a turtle? Think of it. Think of a turtle. What is its outside?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
What
big
is
thick
it?
shell.
And what's the inside? Extremely soft. caring,
Yeah,
and
I was going to say
vulnerable.
soft.
Right?
Yes, yes, very mushy.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
vulnerable to any environmental things that come to it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it has its hard shell.
Yeah.
You're no different.
I identified myself as doing that. I could sometimes picture myself of going into the shell and coming back out. And when I went into, I felt vulnerable, I would go inside. I could feel myself going in.
Right?
Yeah.
To protect.
Yeah. To protect.
But how
Yeah.
ironic is it
Yeah.
that we're sitting here and you're willing to be extremely vulnerable today?
Yes. Because I want people to realize that I'm very strong. So even the strong, you know, we all need help and that there's support out there.
So I want you to look in that camera,
Okay.
and I want you to tell the people who are watching this your message to what they need to know. And I want you to share your story from 2019, looking into that camera,
Okay.
so that they understand that they also are strong and they also need support. And we're going to get into the finer details of what you were like after you tell them the initial bits. And then we're going to kind of talk about when you and I met and what happened with Caregivers Alberta.
Okay.
But this is your opportunity to really share that message.
Okay.